My name is Sallie Wolf. I've been technically working in watercolor for 70 years. My dad gave me paints and a broken brush when I was about 4, and he wanted me to paint so that he could paint me. And I've been playing with watercolor ever since. I started painting more seriously once my first son was born, so that's about 45 years ago. I joined the art league in our town, and I would paint once a night. And after a few years, I realized that what I was learning was how to paint like my instructor. Every time we had a so-called free night where you were doing your own composition, your own source material, I struggled hugely. So I realized it was important for me to start drawing on my own. I took a course at large. That really excited me, and it challenged me, and it pushed me into new ways of thinking. I have been coming up to New Hampshire, to Center Sandwich, since I think 1958. My father bought a house, and that was the first year we were there. I sit on that same beach. I remember when it was mostly boulders and there was very little sand, and then we came one year and they blasted all the boulders out of there and made the beach much bigger. I remember when the road was right on top of the beach, and then the year they pushed it back. So I've seen it change, and yet it doesn't change. The same trees are there except one. It's a view that I know really, really well, and I love. I got married, I moved to Chicago. I felt so removed from the landscapes that I love. Chicago is flat, it's a grid, it's very urban. Where were the woods? I missed New Hampshire. I'd seen houses up here that were filled with little watercolor vignettes of local scenes, and I thought, well, I think I can do that, and I can bring New Hampshire home with me. So that's really how I started working. I would come up here, take photographs, go home to the art league, paint for my photographs. But I became dissatisfied with that pretty quickly, because if you take a photograph of our view from our house, you get a huge expanse of fields. You get a pretty big sense of the sky. And there's this itty bitty little lake in the background and these little bumps behind it. When I look at it, I see a mountain range. I see this lake that meanders along and disappears and shows up again. And these beautiful pine greens of the trees surrounding it, and a little bit of the foreground. And I realized that my use of a camera, because I'm just a snapshot taker, doesn't give me the perspective that I want. And I started to draw it. And I realized I needed an elongated format, and I started working in small postage stamp size rectangles, and I painted my view. And I was trying to push myself to do something bigger. So I put 4 sheets of paper up on the wall, and I was planning to paint. I drew it very carefully in pencil. Planning to paint, I didn't have my brushes at the studio, so I couldn't paint. I didn't want to lose the energy that I felt, because it was intimidating. I needed to keep going forward. So I took charcoal and I filled in all the values, light to dark, in charcoal, trying to avoid outlines. And that was an interesting drawing. It was big, it was 4 sheets. They were turned horizontally, so it was just about this long, but just 4 sheets across. I'd never worked that big before. I felt pretty successful in the charcoal, and I went home, came back the next day with my brushes, and I started putting water on the charcoal. And the paper was mounted on the wall like it is here. And of course the water began to drip. And I kind of liked that. It would carry the charcoal down with it. I was getting these gray drips. And then I came in with color. I started with yellow. And the yellow gets corrupted by the charcoal and was sort of an olivey green. And then I kept adding colors and playing with it, and I went back into it with more charcoal, back and forth and back and forth. Had to let stuff dry. So I spent probably weeks on that painting, on that set of 4 paintings. And I was thinking that each sheet needed to stand alone with a decent composition and color, but that it also worked as a whole. And I was really happy with the result. I was really excited. I'd sort of pushed myself into, I don't know if it's a technique, it's almost any technique of how to work in watercolor. That I can layer it, that I can work over time, and then I use very small sources. One of the things I like about having a small source is that I paint this with a very big brush. I paint it with a 1 or 1.5 inch wide flat brush, so I don't have control over the details. So it already gets a certain level of abstractness. And then when I go big, I don't have details to work with. So I have to think about color and shape and the balance of the composition. I have to think real carefully about what white space I want to leave. Then I start working in, and I tend to work in a succession of colors, starting with yellow, and it's only after I've gotten the warm colors on my paper that I'll go back in with blues and greens. I like to work across the breaks so that I get continuity of color. But you can see the charcoal underdrawing that I had. And I like that here the charcoal's pretty raw and still visible, and here it's mostly blended, but there's little flecks of it. It's about going over and over and over and adjusting and adding and letting the drips happen, encouraging drips by adding a little more water here and there, smearing. It's the original drawing that gives it its form. I'm not drawing very much with my paintbrush. And I call these big brush watercolors because I use the biggest brush I could find. 30-some years old. I'm not sure I could get it again. I bought it on impulse. It was really expensive, but I bought it. And it is the so-called magic brush. It holds a lot of water. I slather the paint on. I can pull it. I can lift a little bit. And I try to paint enough layers that the paint starts to move in ways that I can't control. I get brush strokes, you can sort of see them here, that I didn't necessarily intend. Is not the technique of how the paint gets on, it's being able to see what's there and leave what I like and work with what I don't like. And pushing it, I have to push beyond my beginning because I almost always really like my beginnings. I can see the promise in the painting, but it isn't there yet. And I have to go through a stage of not really liking what's there and come out the other side, hopefully with painting that I'm proud to show. What if you turned your sheets of paper vertical? Because we think of the horizontal, they call the horizontal orientation landscape, is counterintuitive and adds a kind of tension that I like. It also sort of looks like window panes, and we see the world through windows, through gaps in the trees, through a gate. My sketches don't always fit. So then I have to think about, well, how many sheets of paper should I use? When I'm sketching outdoors, I use a travel box. This is Yarka St. Petersburg watercolor paints. I can get all the colors or mix all the colors that I want. And it works everywhere. It works in Antarctica where all you've got is blue, gray, black, and white. It works in Africa where everything is bright and deep green. there's a green in here, it gets the greens that I see here. So to me, New Hampshire is green and blue and brown, touch of yellow, touch of red here and there, very little, unless you're in the fall. This is Da Vinci. It's only 6 colors, 2 yellows, 2 reds, and 2 blues. There's the warm yellow, warm red, and warm blue, and there's the cool yellow, cool red, and cool blue. And with these 6 colors, you can mix any color you need. I'm really happy with my flat brushes. I can get all these thin lines with the edge of the brush. I can get a nice wash. I can fleck things in. You really don't want to erase your watercolor paper. But if I want to erase the pencil line, I use a kneaded eraser, but you have to be very careful or you bruise the paper. And once you bruise the paper, paint sits there in a way that it doesn't sit elsewhere, and you can see that scar. It's a Pelican fountain pen. It does not take cartridges, so I have to travel with ink. So I started doing little pen and ink sketches. You can see the line there, and sometimes I paint first and add the ink over the paint. This one, I'm pretty sure I drew first and painted into it. People sometimes ask me how I do what I do, how can they do watercolor, and it is all about drawing. The whole success of your watercolor hangs on the drawing. So it's not about fancy brushwork or technique, it's about going over and over and over.